All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight's shiur is Le'ilui Nishmat Avimori Dov Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And I just want to also begin by saying that parts of tonight's shiur are based on an essay by Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgott that appears in the book Torah Me'etzion, which on Sefer Bamidbar, which is available from, I think it's Magid Press, if you're really interested in seeing the whole essay. But I'm going to try to develop some of the thoughts that he did in the course of this. But as I said, that's part of it. The rest is this week's parsha. Now, this is one of those few occasions where we actually get to read Matot and Maseh separately. And the parsha of Matot deals, one of the main themes, at least in terms of the content, is the war with Midyan and its aftermath. And it takes up quite a number of psukim in the Torah. And one of the key questions is, why does it take up so much ink? What's so important about this war? So we'll begin with, as I said, it's parshat Perek Lamed Aleph, chapter 31 in Bamidbar is what we're going to be dealing with today. And it begins seemingly innocently enough with that pasuk that's always around, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar. And here we are told, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael me'ed hamidyanim achar tiasef el hamecha. One very short verse of command from Hashem to Moshe, which literally means, Nikom is the root of the word nikama, to take vengeance or revenge. And it seems very strange because generally we know we're not supposed to take revenge. But again, here Moshe is told, Nikom nikmat b'nei Yisrael, avenge on behalf of Bnei Yisrael from the Midianites. And immediately after that, you will be gathered into your people. So I know if I were given a command like that, there would be about 1,520 on the priority list, and I'd make sure I had lots of other things to do. We know, of course, that Moshe doesn't work that way. Hashem tells him to do something, he tries to get it done immediately, and he will, as we're going to see. But before that, first question is, what is Nikmat B'nai Yisrael Me'ed HaMidyanim? Who are the Midyanim? Why are they involved? And why does B'nai Yisrael have to take revenge on them? And so I want to go back to a very similar command from Moshe to Hashem to Moshe, with which we began last week's parsha of Pinchas. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Lemar, again, same pasuk. This is, notice Perek Chav Hey. This is the beginning of last week's parsha of Pinchas. Saroret hamidyanim. There he is told not nikom nikmat nesumet hamidim, but here he is told saroret hamidyanim. Now the word saror comes from the word tsar, which we know from Megillat Esther, where Esther denounced someone as ish tsar, the oyev, tsar meaning an enemy, somebody who you detest. So we are told to saroret hamidyanim, that we are supposed to, with even stronger language of that you have to abhor the Midianites, pikitem otam, and smite them. And then the reason given back in Parshat Pinchas, which we don't have seeming no reason, so again, we have to basically overlap these two parashot and take from there to here. Tzarat HaMidyanim, that kitzorim hein lochem, and the reason is because they hate you through their machinations that they machinated concerning the episode at Peor. Now you'll notice I put Baal Peor here in green, and of course this one got lost somewhere along the way. But the fact is that what was the incident Baal Peor? And concerning Kazbi, who was the daughter of the prince of Midyan, their sister, who was who was smitten on the day of the plague concerning Peor. So we go back, try to understand what was the incident at Baal Peor or Peor, and we go back a further parsha to Parshat Balak. This, by the way, is Perek Chaf Daled. Some of that got lost here. I don't know what happened to it, but this is the chapter before, and it tells us, even after we had the whole story of Balak and Bilam, the last few psukim of that parsha tell us, Vayeshev Yisrael b'Shittim, while Israel were dwelling in Shittim, Vayachel ha'am liznot el benot Moab. The people began to engage in illicit behavior with the daughters of Moab. And then following that, they called the daughters of Moab, called the people to join in their sacrifices to their idols. And the people ate from these offerings and bowed down to these foreign gods. Now, this word vayitzamed here is a very, very strange word. We have a number of different passages in the Midrash to try to explain what this word vayitzamed is. One connects it to the word of tzemed bakar, a pair of oxen that are yoked together, that Israel was joined together to Baal Peor. Midrashically, one Rav wants to tell us that vayitzamed means this incident in Baal Peor is yoked together with the Chet HaEgel. So in some case, in some way, it appears that this incident that happens at Baal Peor, which again, remember, we're dealing with 40 years after the Chet HaEgel, this is the generation that's about to enter Eretz Yisrael, is almost this generation's Chet HaEgel. So again, that's based on this Midrash that says Vayitzamed is paired. So Yisrael was paired with Baal Peor in sin, and as a result, Vayicharaf Hashem b'Yisrael, Hashem is angered at Bnei Yisrael. So the question here is, if we look at the beginning of the parsha, it tells us that the Benot Moab were the ones who were involved in this. Where did Midyan come to get involved in Baal Peor? Now we know at the end of the story, it tells us that as this was happening, there was a Midyanite woman who was brought by one of the people of the children of Israel in front of Moshe, and Pinchas sees this and kills them. So clearly, even though it starts with Benot Moab, it ends with this Midyanit, and that's why we seem to have this connection of Midyan, even though from the face of it, it looks like Moab is the one who is involved. Now, to go back even further, we have to understand that somehow Midyan and Moab are both involved in this Balak story somehow. Because if we go back to the beginning of Parshat Balak, it tells us that Moab was exceedingly afraid of Bnei Israel after they had conquered Sichon and Og. Moab, they were thoroughly afraid of them, that they were going to just wipe them out next. Moab, so Moab took advice from Ziknei Midyan. And the advice, of course, was to go to Balak, and who goes? Ziknei Moab, Ziknei Moab. Midyan. So the elders of Moab and elders of Midyan joined together to seek out Balak and ask him, Bilam, to curse the Jewish people. So all of this seems to say that there's an alliance between Moab and Midyan to try to destroy the Bnei Yisrael spiritually through the power of this prophet Bilam. And ultimately, if we go back to the end of the fact, somehow they decide that the best way, since Bilam couldn't do it, God wouldn't let him curse the Jewish people, the best way to get God angry at the Jewish people is to get him to sin. And so the best way to get him to sin is by appealing to their baser instincts of sexuality and food, and if we get him there, we're okay. We got him. Now we can get him to bow down to idolatry. So it seems as if there's something here going on with Midyan and Moab. So why is it, we have to understand, figure out what it is that causes our parsha to focus entirely not on Moab. Moab is not mentioned at all. This war is strictly against Midyan. Why? What happened to the war against Moab? Now, the Midrashim want to tell us and excuse Moab's behavior because the fact that Moab enlists all of this is because they are actually frightened of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are sitting right on their border. And Midyan really had no business getting involved there, nowhere near geographically, nowhere threatened by the Jewish people. And that is exactly why Hashem says Midianites have to be wiped out, because their entire intent, entire purpose in getting involved in this whole process was to destroy the Jewish people and ultimately to spiritually, not physically destroy the Jewish people, but spiritually destroy the Jewish people. So when Hashem tells Moshe, Nikom Nikmat B'nai Yisrael Me'ed HaMidyanim at the beginning of this week's parsha, this now becomes a spiritual war. This is not a physical war. It's not like the wars we had against Sichon and Og, where we were trying to conquer them. It's not like the war against Amalek, which is a defensive war. It's not like any of the wars that Yoshua is going to fight to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Although it does have an element of those wars, because the reason we were conquering Eretz Yisrael and is to destroy all vestiges of Avodah Zarah. That's one of the key items of Yoshua's conquest, is to destroy all vestiges of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry. So clearly, the Midianites understood this, and perhaps they had an insight into Am Yisrael because Moshe had lived there. They had a good idea of what the Jewish people were about, perhaps more than some of the other nations in the region. And they understood that the strength of the Jewish people is not in our numbers, it's in our allegiance to God. And so if we, the Midianites, know if we, the nations of the world, can break Israel's allegiance to God, then we've got it made. Then we can destroy Israel, because once they're not linked to God, then they're easy prey. And they're not the first people to try to figure that out. They unfortunately probably will not be the last people to try to figure out that the way we destroy the Jewish people is by destroying their link to God. That's the way you do it. That's the only way you can possibly do it. So having said that, we now are starting to get a little bit of an idea of why this is the wars against the Midianites rather than the Moabites, and why there is such an emphasis on this war, because it's different than every other war. It is only about destroying those who wish to destroy us spiritually, as opposed to those who wish to destroy us physically. It is very much akin to the war that is going to be fought a millennia later by the Maccabees to, again, try to destroy those who wish to destroy Judaism, not Jews, but Judaism. And that is a recurring theme throughout Jewish history, that our enemies have two ways they try to destroy us. One is by destroying the Jews, and the other is by destroying Judaism. And we have to fight both of those, but we seem to, it seems to be a much tougher struggle when we are fighting those that want to destroy us spiritually, because often we're also fighting those who are perfectly happy as Jews to not be Jewish, to have no vestige of Judaism. So it's often a double fight when we are fighting those types of battles, as opposed to when we're fighting against those who only want to destroy us physically. We generally get all the Jews united when that happens. Somehow when the battle is a spiritual battle, it's a lot harder to get the consensus of the Jews behind that battle, as we see throughout history. Now we're going to see in this case, that is not the case. Baruch Hashem, they were able to be united, get everybody behind the effort, and that's why they were so successful. But before we get there, it's very interesting that when Hashem speaks to Moshe, he speaks about Nikmat B'nai Yisrael, the vengeance of B'nai Yisrael, that it's the Jews who the Midianites tried to harm, and therefore we have to take vengeance against them for the harm they tried to do to us. That's what Hashem tells Moshe. When Moshe transmits the command to the people in the immediate next pasuk, he says very interestingly, "V'yihu Midyan lateit nikmat Hashem b'Midyan," because Moshe clearly understands that the only reason the Midianites were attacking Bnei Yisrael or were against Bnei Yisrael was because of our connection to Hashem, and as such, the Nikama is Hashem's vengeance. So it becomes, as I said, a very, very spiritual war, a holy war that we have to engage in. And therefore Moshe tells tells all the people. It's interesting, Moshe does not speak to the leadership, he speaks to the people. The people are the one who sinned, not the leaders. Therefore, the people have to be the one who undo that sin. It's got to come from the people. It's got to come from the ground up rather than the top down. And they are to select people to be in the army who are going to fight against Midyan. Now, we then have the amount, Elef Lamatah, 1,000 for each tribe. L'chol Matot Yisrael tishlchu latzava. Every one of the tribes has to send 1,000 men. You would have thought that the larger tribes would have sent a larger contingent. No, because of the nature of this war, it's not a war of conquest that says the more people you have, the more territory you're going to have, the more you got to commit. This is 1,000 people from each tribe representing the entire tribe, fighting on behalf of Hashem again to destroy Midyan. Interestingly enough, there's a whole discussion among the commentaries as to who is included, because it tells us first 1,000 for each tribe, 1,000 per tribe, and then it tells us 12,000 soldiers. And so the question arises, which 12 tribes are selected? Now we know there are two groups of 12 tribes. What do you mean there are two groups of 12 tribes? There are 12 tribes. No, the answer is no. There are two different countings and reckonings of the 12 tribes. One reckoning includes the tribe of Levi and the tribe of Yosef as two tribes. The other one does not include the tribe of Levi and includes Menashe and Ephraim, the two sons of Yosef, as separate tribes. And the commentaries are divided right down the middle on this one as to whether Levi sent soldiers in this campaign or not. Were the Levium represented in the war? And the reason given that they were is because since it's not a war of conquest, they have to participate as members of the Jewish people. The side that says no, that says that anytime there's a Jewish army, the tribe of Levi is exempt from service because they are Hashem's army and they serve in the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan. And as I said, take your pick, which one you'd like. There's one opinion that actually says that there weren't 12,000, but there were really 13,000. There's another opinion that says there weren't 12,000, there were 24,000. So there are all sorts of different parshanut on exactly who went to this war and who fought. We do know one thing: Pinchas ben Elazar HaKohen goes to the army with them, and he takes Klei HaKodesh and the Chatzotzot HaTorah are under his care. There's again debate about whether Klei HaKodesh includes the Aron or not, whether the Aron actually went to war with them as part of the battlefront or stayed back in the camp. Again, machloket among the parshanut as to whether Klei Kodesh refers to something other than the Aron or it refers to the Aron also. So that's another machloket as to how the war was taken up. So this is all the preparation. Then we get to the actual war. Actual war is described in 2 psukim. Remember, this chapter is 50 some odd psukim. The actual war is described in 2 psukim. Vayitzku al Midyan, the army went toward Midyan. Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. By the way, that's a very important phrase. Kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe. We've seen it before. We'll see it again in this week's parsha, and we're going to draw some parallels to other times where we see that phrase repeated over and over again. But Vayagu kol zachar, they kill all the adult males. That's the first thing they do in this war. That's the only thing they do, including, by the way, included in that, and that's the whole war, by the way, is verse 7. Verse 8 gives you some of the people who are included in the casualty count. The kings of Midyan, they kill together with their soldiers. The 5 kings are mentioned: Avi, Rechem, Tzur, Chur, and Reva. Chameshet Melchei Midyan. Why there are 5 kings mentioned in Midyan? Because if we go back to Avram Avinu and the birth of Midyan, by the way, Midyan, so just for all those of you who have forgotten your Sefer Bereshit, Midyan is one of the sons of Avraham and Keturah. He has 5 sons. That's why there are 5 sub-tribes in Midyan. Each have their own king. That's why there are 5 kings. You can go back to parshat Chayis at the end of parshat Chayis. You'll see all these names and all of the story about where Midyan comes from. Okay, now here is something that seems totally and completely out of place. You had Bilam ben Ba'or hargu b'Charan. Bilam, the son of Ba'or, they killed with the sword in the middle of this campaign in Midyan. And the question is, what was Bilam ben Ba'or, who didn't live in Midyan? What was he doing in Midyan? In the first place, that he got caught up in the battle. All sorts of interesting midrashim about this. One, of course, is that he came to collect his fee for causing the plague that we read about in Baal Pa'or. Others say that he came to join in the battle because the kings of Midyan realized, hey, they could not naturally beat the Jewish people. The only way they could beat the Jewish people was by having some spiritual power on their side. and they brought him quickly to this battle to try to figure out a way they could avoid losing to the Jewish people. Didn't work, and Bilam meets this fate together with the rest of the people. Okay, so now the rest of the chapter is going to deal with what happens after the war. And as I said, you're going to see it seems a very lengthy and almost redundant, lots of extra verbiage in this parsha. So we're going to try to get to that and try to understand why that is. Okay. Now, we told you that they killed all the males. So they took by Yishbu, they took as captives all the wives of Midyan, Neshei Midyan, all the women, and Tapam, all the women and children were taken as captive. Yet Kol Behem Tam, all the animals, Kol Mikneim, all their cattle, Yet Kol Chelam, and all of their possessions, Bazazu, they took as spoils. Okay, so basically Midyan was totally wiped out among the male population. The females, the children are brought, and all of the possessions and cattle, etc., are brought to the camp as spoils. Now, again, the aftermath of the war continues. At a kol aram b'moshvotam yet kol tirotam sarfu ba'esh. They burned all of their cities and all of their palaces were burned. Again, remember, this is not a war of conquest. They had no intention of occupying this land. They just did not want any vestige of Midyan to remain, so everything is burned to the ground. And then by all of this, all of the spoils that were available, they took ba'adam uvavema, both people and cattle. By Yaviu el Moshe el Elazar, they bring it to Moshe and to Elazar, they spoke to the entire congregation. At Hashvi, Shvi is the captives among the humans. Malkoach is the captives among the animals. Shalal is all the movable possessions that they were able to take, gold, silver, whatever they were able to take. Elamachaneh. So the soldiers take it all home. Elavot Moav al Yarden Yerecho. Back to where they started. Okay, that's the end of the excursion. As I said, the war is 2 psukim. We spend 4 psukim talking about the aftermath of the war. Okay, and now we get back to the camp. So Vayetu Moshe ve'Elazar Kohen v'chol Nesiei ha'Edah likrotam al mechutz lamachaneh. Moshe, on hearing word that they're on their way back, comes out to meet them outside the camp together with Elazar. Remember, Aaron is dead, so Elazar is taking his place, and all the princes of the different tribes come to meet them. Vayitzof Moshe Moshe is angered at the officers of the army, the Sori Alafim, Sori Me'ot, the officers of thousands, 100 Habayim Mitzvah Milchama that came from the war. What is he angry about? He says, how could you let the women alive? They're the ones who caused the problem. They were the ones who seduced the men to join them and become worship idols. So how could you allow that to happen? Now, it's very interesting, though, how Moshe describes that. He says, Heina, these exact women who you've just taken as captives, okay, these are the same women who listened to the word of Bilam, that caused the Jews to sin concerning the Pa'or. And they caused this great plague among the congregation. So Moshe says, this isn't going to work. When you thought you did everything you had to do, you killed all the adult males. That wasn't it. No, you got more work to do. So therefore, now you have to kill all the Zachar Bataf, all the male children have to be killed. And any female who was of sexual age has to be killed. So now we today, looking at this on our quote, politically correct classes, would say, what kind of nonsense is this? My God, they're non-competents. How can we kill? I understand you got to kill the competents. These are all non-competents. Why are we killing them? The answer is because the whole purpose of destroying Midyan is to destroy those who are trying to make you sin, to take you away from God. Failing to do that means you haven't done the job. If you haven't removed those that are trying actively to cause you to sin, you haven't done your job. That's exactly what here. Whether it's politically correct under today's rules or not is not the issue. The issue here is survival of the Jewish people. And survival of the Jewish people depends on our ability to maintain our relationship with Hashem to the exclusion of certainly idolatry, immorality. And those people whose whole raison d'etre is to try to cause the Jews to be distanced from God by taking them into the reigns of idolatry and immorality are to be dealt with swiftly and directly, no questions asked. And that's exactly Moshe's lesson. And that's really, I think, one of the focuses of this week's of this whole story is that we cannot compromise when it comes to destroying those who wish to destroy us spiritually. The same way we could compromise theoretically with those who wish to destroy us physically. We can possibly convince them to cease and desist or be stronger than them so that they'll leave us alone. Whereas those that want to destroy us spiritually are going to continue to try to sneak through the cracks. They can't be convinced away. That's the lesson of this week's this story. One of the lessons. Okay. Now then Moshe adds, seemingly strangely, but the women who are young, who are kids, the young children who are female, you can allow to remain alive. Why he has to say that when he's just told them who to kill, I don't know. Great question. Didn't really see anything that specifically addresses that, but it's to explicitly, I guess, include them so that we'll understand later when it gets to count where all these women come from. And then we're told some laws, and then we get to a whole section of laws that pertain to what we are to do with all of the goods that were taken. I'm going to skip that for a minute because it talks us basically the laws of how when you acquire something from a non-Jew, how you go about making it use. The laws basically of what we call today tfilat kelim, of when you buy something from a non-Jewish source that's made by a non-Jewish source, you have to take it if it's a metal utensil or a glass utensil and bring it into the mikvah. And it has nothing to do with whether it was used or not, whether it's ever has to be koshered or not. In addition, we have the laws of koshering something that has been used for non-kosher products. Now, we today, we can buy pots and pans so easily and relatively cheaply that we don't worry about that. But up until that became readily available, this was a very important parsha in the Torah that talks about how we go about taking used metal things, used glassware, and koshering it, and then, of course, totaling it, what those laws are. Okay, I'm going to skip that and continue with the rest of the parak. So remember, we're now up to pasuk Chaf Hey 25. We've gone through 24 psukim, and really only 2 talked about the war. Now Hashem gives Moshe a very interesting command. He says, I want you to count all of the living items that were captured in this war, both man and animals. Do it together with everybody. And now here's how you're going to divide the spoils. The army gets half, and everybody else, the general population, gets the other half. So it's not that the army gets all the spoils here. The army gets half of the spoils to divide up. The rest of the population gets the other half to divide up. But each of these halves have an obligation. Among the army who went out to fight, they have to take a tax. 1 out of every 500 from the people, the cattle, the donkeys, the sheep. Everything that is captured, they have to take 1 out of every 500. And these are to be given L'Elazar Kohen Trumat Hashem, as a Truma to Hashem. That word Truma, we're familiar with, of course, from Sefer Shemot, where we have a parsha called Truma, which tells us about giving Truma. That when the Bnei are about to build a Mishkan, we have to give Truma. So it's very interesting here that it uses the same language of Truma when it talks about taking this tax that is to be given to Elazar HaKohen. Now, again, from the other half that go to Bnei Yisrael, we take 1 out of every 50, but those are to be given to the Leviim, Shomrei Mishmeret Mishkan Hashem, the watchers of Hashem's, the Mishkan. And now we have a very, very interesting pasuk. We've never seen a pasuk anywhere similar to this before. Vayas Moshe ve'Elazar HaKohen, because normally it's Moshe alone. Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. Again, very, very similar phraseology to where? To the whole construction of the Mishkan. If we go back to parshat Pikudei, we remember that the whole parshat Pikudei, every chapter, 18 times in that chapter, in that parsha, we have that phrase Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe concerning the building of the Mishkan. Now, if we think about it, and this is where I'm borrowing from Rabbi Helfgott's essay, the building of the Mishkan happened when? Right after the Chet HaEgel. Chet HaEgel, what was the thing that Bnei Yisrael had to do to atone for the Chet HaEgel? They had to give a truma to build the Mishkan. Asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, as Hashem commanded Moshe. Remember, that was the first generation, the generation that left Egypt. We're 40 years later. They've committed a very similar sin of idolatry at Baal Peor, and now they have to seemingly do something similar. They have to take a truma al Hashem from all of this spoils that they've taken. Now, it's a little different than taking truma out of your pocket, which they had to do in the case of the Chet HaEgel, but nonetheless, the fact that the Torah seems to use this word truma, this phrase kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, seems to link these two chapters together. And if we think about it, if we think about the work of the Mishkan, one of the most prominent things about the whole story of the Mishkan is the fact that everything gets repeated over and over again. We have God commands Moshe to build it, and then he tells the Jewish people to build it. Then it tells them how they built it. Again, over and over again, we have very, very seemingly, we have four parshas that discuss only the work of the Mishkan. Lots of ink spent on the Mishkan to show us its importance in Bnei Yisrael achieving atonement for the Chet HaEgel. So perhaps Rabbi Helfgott wants to suggest that the reason we have so much verbiage in this parsha, again, and it's all repetitive, it's saying they counted the spoils, and the first half that they gave to people was this much, and then the second half that they gave to the other people was this much, and they took this much from each one. Again, it seems to be going over and over the same thing. When the Torah could have just said, okay, I would have stopped the parsha here. They did after exactly what he did. So now, why does the Torah now add another 20 psukim of what? How much did they take? They took 670,500 sheep. Do I care how many sheep they took? Do I care how many cattle they took? Do I care how many donkeys they took? Do I care how many people there were? But it lists exactly a pasuk for each of them. And then it's going to give us twice. It's going to tell us the first half was, well, I know how to divide by 2. Why does the Torah know how to divide something in half? Why does the Torah go through this? Again, as I said, Rabbi Helfgott wants to suggest that the reason is, just like in the Mishkan, we have to repeat everything over and over again for emphasis to show that this is an important aspect of achieving the atonement. It wasn't enough to just say Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe once. We have to say it over and over again with each step of the process. And each step of the process here was counting, the dividing, the separation. So each step in the process is its own step and has to be delineated individually in order to show us the importance of the whole process. It's an interesting theory, being that I haven't seen any other theory that explains why the Torah has all of this ink used when we know that the Torah generally is very succinct, direct, compact, doesn't try to add words, but here clearly there seems to be a plethora of words that clearly seem to be superfluous, excuse me. Okay, again, same phraseology, right? Trumat Hashem, that concept of that it's a Truma Hashem. Again, Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe at the end of separating that which was given to the Kohanim. Again, same phrase, Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe at the end of separating that which was given to the people. Now, up until now, we've focused on the people and the army. Now, if we think back to the Melechet HaMishkan, we know that everybody gave willingly. There was one portion that you had to give That was a requirement, your half shekel, but everything beyond that was given voluntarily. Then at the end of the Mishkan process, we know that the Torah then records that the Nesiim, the leaders, gave a gift to the Mishkan. They gave the wagons and the cattle that we read about in Parshat Naso. And now, interestingly enough, in another parallel to that almost, it says, the officers who were in charge of the army all came to Moshe, the Sarei Alafim, Sarei Me'ot, the leaders, I guess these were the Sarei Alafim were each tribal leader, and the Sarei Me'ot were the sub-leaders under that. We've counted, we've selected, we've gone through all of the people who were with us, and not one is missing. Wow, that's a pretty special war to go fight. You just wiped out the whole people without a single casualty. Therefore, we, the officers who witnessed this and who understand this monumental miracle, we are bringing a korban Hashem, an offering to Hashem. Anybody who found any gold jewelry of any type, there are all different types of jewelry, rings, bracelets, nose rings, etc. All of these different types of jewelry, what do they bring it? As an atonement for our souls before Hashem. Interestingly enough, same phraseology we see in the beginning of the Mishkan. When you give your half shekel, it should be as an atonement for your soul. So again, another parallel to the Cheder Egel / Mishkan story here in the Baal Peor / war against Midyan story. They take it, and again, the Torah calls it a truma, calls a hava truma, she'erimul Hashem, and it gives the exact amount. And who was it taken from? The Sarei Alafim and the Sarei Me'ot. However, Anshe Hatzava, the regular army guys, bazazu each low. They took whatever they wanted, and again, this is now finally after 54 psukim, we end the story about the war. So the fact here is that this parsha, in terms of the word, seems to take, as I said, a lot of ink. And I think the Torah wants to emphasize a number of things. Number one, the fact that we, the Jewish people, have a greater enmity for those that try to remove us from Hashem, that those who try to lead us to sin, as opposed to those who wish to kill us. Because we understand people want to kill us all the time. But when people try to interfere with our relationship with Hashem, we have to take drastic action. Not that we don't when our lives are at stake. I don't want you to think that that it's okay to just, let's go just kill some Jews. That's not okay either. Because the reason they want to kill us is because we're Jewish, generally. I mean, although there are among our enemies who will not discriminate between those who are observant and those who are not yet observant, nonetheless, the people who want to kill Jews generally want to kill them because we are different. We are the people who are the conscience of the world. We are those that are trying to teach the world that there is a God, that he cares about how we live, as opposed to those who would like to live their lives haphazardly according to the rules of the jungle. And so that's, as I said, one of the key lessons of the parasha. I think it's emphasized by Moshe calling it Nikmat Hashem, as opposed to Hashem calling it Nikmat B'nai Yisrael. I think it's emphasized by this whole concept of Truma, L'chaper al nafshotenu, and the fact that, as I said, throughout this whole parsha, we again have this phrase, Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, that we, the Jewish people, are bound to the laws of the Torah as we receive them from Moshe, because that is how we retain our identity, and hopefully, Bezrat Hashem will be successful in achieving our mission, only through doing Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. Our challenge, of course, as always, is to understand what it is Hashem wants us to do, which I guess it was a lot easier for that generation when Moshe was there to directly transmit it, to answer all questions. But nonetheless, we have an obligation to try to study as well best we can that which Hashem wants us to do, so that we can do Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, and ultimately we will be able to achieve our mission and be zochet kula shleim her yamein. At this point, I open it up to questions, comments, and feedback. Anybody and everybody.
Okay. Yeah.
Anybody? David?
Yeah. Hi.
Go ahead.
So the Midianite girls who were captured, who weren't killed, they were among the people that were allowed to enter the land of Israel.
Yes. They were all, I guess, they were all under the age of, presumably the age of maturity, because that's the pasuk says that they had to be below the age of maturity, and as such, the commentaries seem to imply that they were, I guess, educatable at that age. Now it's interesting because we have another instance where it seems to be, even though the women are the ones who are the tools used, it's the men who seem to be behind the plot to get the women to act the way they did. So they're the ones who get punished rather than the women. Although the women who are of age, being that they were the actual ones involved in the sin, also get punished for agreeing to participate. Whereas the young women who are not part of the sin and didn't participate, they get spared. So, and they get into Eretz Yisrael because they are taken as part of the Jewish people. They move on, I guess. And what happens to them? The presumption is that they converted, or at least to not necessarily to Judaism, but at least to accept the 7 Noahide laws, because that was the prerequisite when Jews conquer Eretz Yisrael. That was the prerequisite for anybody who was not Jewish to be allowed to stay in Eretz Yisrael, was they had to accept the 7 universal commandments. So, how well that was applied, can't answer. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah. Well, the point it seems to be, I mean, one of the things that we often say, and David's comment was, this is very similar, reminiscent of the wars that Joshua fights, where he is told to destroy all of the indigenous inhabitants who live in Eretz Yisrael. And Midrash tells us that Yoshua, before he entered Eretz Yisrael, and as he was entering Eretz Yisrael, sent out pamphlets. I don't know what the equivalent, how he managed to get the word out, but sent the word out that to the Jewish, to all of the people living there. We're coming to conquer the land that God has given us. You have 3 choices. Choice number 1, you can accept the 7 mitzvot, 7 ochad mitzvot. You can leave and continue to be idolaters. If you don't like A or B, we're going to have to kill you if you stay. And that again is the same reason. It's the same rationale for the war here with Midyan, that though if they're idolaters and they're convinced of their idolatry, they're going to try to convert us to their idolatry, and we have to remove them so that we can have a relationship with God without idolatry. Now, it begs the question, why are we killing them? It's our own fault. We got to be stronger. And you're absolutely right. But Hashem tells us that idolatry, the lure of idolatry and immorality is so strong that it's very hard. It's very hard to withstand. And interestingly enough, the Talmud tells us that in the period of the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, after the destruction of the first temple, they prayed to God to remove the Yetzer Hara that we have for idolatry. And God said, okay. And then they asked God to remove the Yetzer Hara that we have for immorality, for sexuality. And God said, you better be careful with this one, guys. And after a while, they realized, wait a minute, if that's the case, that's the end of the world, because nobody will have a desire to procreate and there'll be no next generation. So it's I don't say it's necessarily evil. It's a necessary tool that we need. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't maintain, we wouldn't peru if we didn't have a sexual drive. Our challenge is to be able to control that, to use that appropriately. Why that isn't the same thing with idolatry? Good question. I don't know why God agreed to remove, but I guess idolatry, from one sense, there's no need for it. Unfortunately, I guess if it also diminishes your spirituality because you don't have that same desire to serve God, perhaps. So that's what you need to work on, serving God. As I say, why idolatry seemed to at that point be so pervasive and so available was because I think that's part of it. The fact that it's pervasive, that it's all present, makes it that much harder to resist. Whereas if you're living in a community where you've been able to remove that, it makes it a lot easier to, if it's outside of who you are, outside of where you are, it's a lot easier to resist than if it's right in your face. I guess that's the reason why.
I mean, with the whole period of dresses, backsliding,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
Idolatry, and then the vocabulary.
Right. I mean, maybe again, but as I said, the Medrash says that, they basically prayed to God that he should remove it. Now, as I said, is idolatry today alive and well? Probably is, but not necessarily in the forms that it was then, and not necessarily as pervasive as it was then. Now, again, it depends on where you are. I don't know. I can't say I've investigated every tribe in Africa, in the outback, in the wilds of who knows where. I don't know, but I suspect that we have different idols that we worship today. Maybe we don't bring offerings to them the same way, but we have idols that we worship today. We might call them wealth. We might call them power. We might call them the rich and the famous. It depends on who you are. Everybody has their own challenges. But at least, as I said, what we would think of as classical idols, bowing down to a piece of stone, we don't have as often, although in a lot of the Eastern religions, that does still exist. So anyway, I'm going to just stop because Lois asked the question and she has no voice in audio, so I'm going to read it from the chat. She wants to know, how do I figure out how old the younger women were? That's a good one. The Midrash says very simply that they all have to pass in front of the Aron, and the Aron somehow signaled whether they were of age or not of age. There are other Midrashim that talk about different techniques they used to tell whether they were of age or not. So there were different mechanisms used. I guess none of them had birth certificates at the time, so they couldn't have checked. So thank you for that question, and I hope that answers it. Okay, any other comments, questions?
Idolatry is inherently cultural, but sexuality is imbued in the human being. There's a definite difference.
Oh yeah, there's no question. And again, idolatry is not necessarily a requirement for the continuity of humanity, whereas sexuality clearly is. Although I don't know, another couple of generations, the way they're going, we may not need it anymore. Although I suspect that that's a whole different topic for a whole different issue.
Sure.
So thank you all for joining. Any other questions, comments before we close for the evening? Thank you all for joining.